Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence. "Here," cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown over the last few minutes. And she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all of the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, where they lay sprawling about. This reminded her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I do beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay. She began picking them up as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. All of them," he repeated with great emphasis. He looked directly at Alice as he said so. Alice looked down at the jury box and saw that, in her haste, she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail all about in a melancholy way, and he was quite unable to move on his own. She soon got the lizard out again and put him in right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in a trial one way up as another." As soon as the jury had recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with his mouth open, and he gazed into the roof of the court with wide eyes and open mouth. "Tell me, what do you know about this business?" the king asked Alice. "I don't know anything," said Alice. "Nothing whatever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said. He turned to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course." He said this very respectfully, but he frowned, and he made some faces unintentionally. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king hastily said, and he went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important." He tried to decide which word sounded best. At least, that's what it looked like to Alice. Some of the jury wrote down important, and some wrote down unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over at their slates. But it doesn't matter one bit, she thought to herself. At this moment, the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his own notebook, cackled out, "Silence!" and he read from his book, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high must leave the court." Everyone's eyes turned towards Alice. "I am not 1 mile high," said Alice. "Yes, you are," said the king. I think she's 2 miles high, added the Queen. Well, I shan't go, at any rate, said Alice. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. I saw you. It's the oldest rule in the book, said the King. If it's the oldest rule, said Alice, then why isn't it rule number 1? The King turned pale at this and shut his notebook hastily. Consider your verdict, jury, he said, though his voice trembled slightly. There's more evidence to come yet, please your majesty, said the White Rabbit. He jumped up in a great hurry. This paper has just been picked up. What's in it then, said the Queen. I haven't opened it yet, said the White Rabbit. But I think it's a letter written by the prisoner to somebody. It must have been that, said the King, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't all that unusual, you know. Who is it directed to? Asked one of the jurymen. It isn't directed at all, said the White Rabbit. In fact, there's nothing written on the outside. He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, This isn't a letter at all. It looks like a set of verses. Are they in the prisoner's handwriting? Asked another of the jurymen. No, they're not, said the White Rabbit. And that's the strangest thing about this. The jury looked equally puzzled. He must have imitated somebody else's hand, said the King. The jury nodded. They looked like they agreed. Please your majesty, said the knave. I didn't write this, and they can't prove it. There's no name signed at the end. Well, if you didn't sign it, said the King, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd signed your name like an honest man. There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the King had said all day. I think it proves his guilt, said the Queen. No, it proves nothing of the sort, said Alice. Why, we haven't read it yet. You don't even know what it says. Okay then, said the King. Read them then. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin? Please your majesty, he asked. Begin at the beginning, the King said gravely, and go on until you come to the end, and then stop. These were the verses the White Rabbit read. They told me you had been to her and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent the word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1. They gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been an obstacle that came between him and ourselves, and it seems them know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me, and no one else. No one else will ever see. The king looked very solemn. That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet. He rubbed his hands together. Now let the jury. If any one of them can explain this, said Alice, though she had grown so large in the last few minutes that now she was not afraid of interrupting him. If any one can explain this, she repeated, I'll give him 6 pence. I don't believe there's anything in there. There's no meaning to this. The jury wrote down on their slates, she doesn't believe in this or the meaning of it. But none of them attempted to explain the verses. If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves us a world of trouble, and we needn't try to find any trouble for no reason. Although yet, I don't know, he went on. He spread the verses out on his knee, and he looked at them askance. I seem to see some meaning in them after all, he said. Said I could not swim. That's one of the verses. You can't swim, can you? He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like I could swim? He said, which he certainly did not, thought Alice, being that he was a card made entirely out of cardboard. All right, so far, said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself. We know it to be true. That means the jury, of course. I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, I think. But it goes on, said Alice. They all returned from him to you. Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. Nothing can be more clear than this. Then again, before she had this fit, that line, you never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen. Never, said the queen furiously. She threw an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little lizard, named Bill, had left off writing on his slate with 1 finger, as he found it made no mark. But he now hastily began again, using the ink thrown at him, because it was trickling down his face, and would last for a short while. Then the words don't fit you, said the king. He looked around the court with a smile. There was a dead silence in the room. I think it's a pun, the king added, although he said this as slightly offended, and everyone laughed. Let the jury consider their verdict now, the king said. For about the 20th time that day, thought Alice. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, girl, said the queen. Her face began turning purple. I will not, said Alice. Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved, for Alice was now a giant. Who cares for you, said Alice. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, the whole pack rose up into the air, and they came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off. And as she found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice. She was so confused how she had gotten back. And she told her sister, as well as she could remember, all of these strange adventures of hers that you have been hearing about today. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream she had had in Wonderland. But her sister sat still, just as she had left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all of her wonderful adventures, until she too began dreaming after a fashion. And this was her dream. First, she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice and see that strange little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution, off with their heads. Once more, the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed all around them. And once more the shriek of the griffin, the squeaking of the lizard slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs. This filled the air, and all was mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on with closed eyes and half believed herself in Wonderland as well, though she knew she had but to open her eyes again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby from the pepper, the shriek of the griffin, and all of the other strange noises would change. She knew this to be sure. They would change to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sob. lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman one day, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland from long ago, and how she would feel from all their simple sorrows and find pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days of Wonderland. The end. And that, my dear darling, is the end of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Thank you so much for listening. Sweet and creepy dreams, my darling.